Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody, to Environmental Ethics, PPD 270. My name is Dave Feldman. I also want to welcome our teaching assistant this quarter, Alexis Hickman, who's a doctoral student in the department. We're very privileged to have her. I want to begin by a bit of an apology. This is the first day of spring quarter 2012, and as you're watching this in class, I'm actually hosting a 20th anniversary luncheon for the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program for the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design, so I could not be with you. I do, however, want to spend some time with you this afternoon introducing the subject of environmental ethics, which is what we're going to be studying this quarter. So please get comfortable and just make yourself at home. I want to begin by, first of all, going through some logistical issues for the course. There are a lot of you this quarter, and I know one of the concerns that arises is whether or not there'll be participation. There most definitely will. I'm not going to monopolize the discussion. There will be some lectures, but there'll be ample opportunities for questions, comments, and class-wide debate over these issues. Environmental ethics in particular, and ethics in public policy more generally, is an extremely important subject. It's a subject that demands interaction between instructors and students and other students. And so we're definitely going to have a lot of opportunity for that. In addition to other logistical issues, as you know from reading the syllabus, which is posted on the Class EEE site, there is a large project due at the end of the quarter in early June, 12 to 15 page paper. Subjects are wide open. I urge and encourage you to come and talk with me about whatever you'd like to do. I might be able to suggest some sources and even some topics. The only stipulation is that it be related broadly to the ethics of public policy and hopefully to environmental policy. A second issue, there will be a series of short paper assignments, basically every week or so. Beginning next week, 1/3 of you will be doing a short 2 to 3 page paper answering questions that are on the syllabus. And this will depend on whether or not you're part of Group A, B, or C. And those, of course, have been appointed prior to the beginning of the class, and I emailed a list indicating which of those 3 groups that you're in. So with that, if there are any questions that Alexis cannot answer this afternoon, I'll be back here on Thursday to talk about them. So let's go ahead and talk about environmental ethics and ethics in public policy. And let me begin with a question, really the topic for this week's discussion, both today and on Thursday, which is policy ethics and philosophy, or knowing what's ethical. This is a huge, huge issue in public policy generally, and certainly in the ethics of environmental policy. And I want to begin class today by offering you a couple of stories. Stories are important, both in talking about public policy and certainly in talking about the environment. In fact, there's a huge tradition in the field of environmental ethics, one that we're going to begin exploring in the readings this week in both Bella and in the other textbook that you have, which broadly introduces ethical principles in public policies by Blum. And that is the narrative tradition, or the tradition of storytelling. And in that spirit, let me begin with a true story. This occurred back in 1997 when researchers from 4 countries, Brazil, Sweden, Holland, and the United States, got together and tried to estimate the value, the economic value, of the world's so-called ecosystem services. And just to explain this in a little bit of detail, ecosystem services are all of those functions that planet Earth serves to basically protect the survival of the human species and, of course, the variety of flora and fauna on the planet. Now, the goal of this academic exercise was to convince urban planners, public policymakers, and others of the need to protect natural resources and the environment by actually ascribing a specific value that could be taken into account in public policy decisions. It's what we might call an empirical or practical problem, but as we're going to see momentarily, it's a problem that had ethical or moral implications. Now what they did as economists is they first divided the Earth's surface into different biomes. That is to say, different regions that could be characterized as oceans, forests, wetlands, deserts, and so forth. And then what they did is they compiled economic values for the services that have been estimated or provided by each of these biomes or regions of the Earth according to various economic studies. And then what they did further is they multiplied each set of services by the land area of this particular biome on the Earth. So for example, 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered by ocean, so they would multiply basically the value of the oceans by that figure. And then that would be a factor of how much would be devoted to the value of oceans to the survival of human beings, and of course the survival of the world's fisheries and other resources that depend on the oceans. And they came up, as you can see on the slide, with a total value. And the value, as in most economic or scientific studies, had a range associated with it, anywhere from 16 to 54 trillion dollars. Somewhere around 33 trillion was the estimated average in US dollars. Now to compare the meaning or the magnitude of that dollar figure, consider that in 1997, when this study was done, the estimated global gross national product, that is to say, if you took all the 170 plus nations on the planet and added up all the value of all the goods and services produced by these societies, you would come out with a figure of $18 trillion, which is roughly a little over half of what the value of the total of ecosystem services are. So a very significant study. One could say it was a mental exercise. One could say it was an experiment. We can call it many things. But as we're going to see momentarily, it's an experiment and it's a story that has great implications for public policy and considerable implications for environmental policy. So let's take a look at that by exploring, first of all, some of the problems that were prompted in this experiment. Well, one of the things that this experiment was designed to do and succeeded in doing was calling attention to the fact that the environment generally, or what we call the ecosystem services provided by the environment, have a real economic value that must be incorporated into the study of economics. So in other words, from an ethical standpoint, when people say that we're making choices between development on the one hand or protection of the environment on the other, what this experiment is suggesting is not true. In fact, ecosystem services, the things that planet Earth and all the resources on the planet do naturally, whether it be providing nutrients, whether it be generating oxygen, whether it be consuming carbon dioxide, all of these services and many more actually have a value that makes them, in a sense, intrinsically valuable. And we're going to come back to that issue a little later on. Another problem or challenge is that this experiment was intended to change human behavior, more particularly to urge policymakers around the world to think about how economic systems that manage global and national economies are obligated to ensure what we call ecological sustainability, as well as an equitable or fair global distribution of the resources provided by these ecosystem services. So here we have another ethical issue of public policy. And again, I want to lay these out because these are the kinds of themes that recur repeatedly when we talk about ethics and environmental policy, and more generally ethics and public policy. So not only calling attention to the fact that the environment has value, but here now actually seeking reform or policy change. Decision makers, take into account the value of the environment when you make decisions over allocation of goods and services, and when you make decisions regarding the sustainability of these resources. So far, so good. But let's consider some other debates, empirical in part, but also quite ethical or philosophical. A study. Is it a valid study? And if it's not entirely valid, should we care? Does that have ethical implications? Well, there was a lot of debate over the study, which was authored principally by Robert Costanza, an economist at the University of Maryland, and his associates from all of these other countries that were involved. Some feel that the estimates of the ecosystem services may be too large. Some feel that the estimates may be too small. So far as we're concerned, the debate over the magnitude of these estimates is very important, because one of the characteristics about ethical issues in public policy generally is, although the world of ethics exists separately from the world of science, the validity of our ethical values often hinges on the validity of our empirical arguments. If we're saying that something is good because it does something, and it doesn't really do that, then our ethical values may be put into question. And so I simply use this point to illustrate the debate over whether or not the study was accurate in itself, whether it was too broadly inclusive or not inclusive enough, whether it overestimated or underestimated, also has ethical implications. As students of public policy and urban planning, we have to be very conscious of how empirical claims have these ethical implications. And I also want you to think about this issue. It's one that we'll come back to repeatedly in this course, and it certainly applies to this story. Can all ecosystem services really be expressed in a monetary value? Whether it be a US dollar or the euro or the yen or whatever currency you want, can we actually say that, that air, water, and soil can somehow be valued, and that we could find replacements for them that we could actually go out and purchase at a store or through a vendor? Now, when you think about a question like that, and this is a debate that goes on constantly in environmental issues, and it also resonates into other public policy areas, it raises another very important kind of ethical issue that we talk about both in the field of the environment and in public policy more generally. And that is, can we really reduce value to economics? Or more broadly, can we reduce value to something that is part of the way human societies value their exchanges? Or are there other criteria that we need to incorporate? And as we're going to see beginning today and extending into Thursday when I actually come and are able to interact with you directly, this is a debate that is characterized in different ways by different ethical traditions in public policy. And then finally, here's another ethical quandary. A different kind of ethical question yet, but one that definitely stems directly from this study. The authors of this study were trying to infer the value of ecosystem services to be able to answer some broad questions about what we need to do to make sure that the environment is sustainable, and also to make sure how we can somehow fairly or equitably allocate the value of the environment for all of humanity and for other species. But here we get into a different kind of an ethical question that often arises in the field of public policy generally and environmental policy in particular. couldn't you use a study like this for, shall we say, nefarious purposes? Oh, well, now that we know the actual value produced by that ecosystem service, and we know that that value isn't, say, as high as some other service or some other resource that can be replaced by going to a different region where they have tropical rainforests or pristine rivers, why don't we go ahead and justify development projects that might destroy ecosystem services in one place, knowing that there's ample ecosystem services provided somewhere else? Now, you get the point. The point here is basically that we have to be very careful not only of how we do studies that have ethical implications in public policy, we not only have to be careful in what we do and what we conclude, but we have to think further about how others might use our interpretations for pursuing other kinds of policy agendas. And indeed, this was a major concern that arose in this study. Well, that's one kind of a story. It's a story that happens to use as its object the social sciences, in particular the economic sciences, although certainly political scientists and other fields, urban planning as well, are very concerned with economic values and imputing value to things as a way of determining what kinds of policy decisions we're supposed to make. But let me turn to another kind of a narrative, another kind of a story that also has some important ethical implications. This one began in the early part of the last decade, 2003 in particular. There was a book written by David Carl, a well-known environmental writer here in California. He's an environmental activist. He served for a time as a California State Parks ranger, and he's a writer on water policy. He's written extensively on the subject, and some of you know I have an interest in water policy, and I will confess to being a great fan of David's writings. Well, in 2003, he wrote a book in which he wanted to suggest some reforms in California's water policy specifically, and more generally some food for thought in terms of how people throughout the United States and even throughout the world could learn to better manage that precious, irreplaceable resource. The key suggestion he made in this book turned out to be quite contentious. He said that what we have to do is to achieve a stable state population in California, and we need to do this as soon as possible. Now, his goal in this book was to convince, again, urban and regional planners, public policymakers, and the general public of the need to protect California's water supply by, as he put it, just saying no to water use, to voluntarily stabilize their numbers, the numbers of people using water, and how we use water. How do we do this? Well, he actually came up with a number of strategies, some of which have been enacted in California and elsewhere, some of which, in fact, were in the process of being enacted even before he wrote this book. One suggestion is not to import more water into California's lush cities. We do that a lot. Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego, the state's three largest cities, import their water from hundreds of miles away, and they'll continue to do so for the indefinite future. However, they are actually decreasing the amount of water they're importing by reusing or reclaiming wastewater, by banking water in aquifers or underground groundwater storage facilities, and through other means as well. In addition, and here's where we get into some really interesting debate, Carl said the reason Californians are so profligate in their use of water, much like Westerners throughout the western half of the United States is because we encourage too much in-migration from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So what we need to do is to discourage in-migration from other states and, oh yes, discourage immigration from other nations, particularly other countries that have high birth rates, high fertility rates. You could imagine the firestorm of outrage. Some people lashed out at Carl when he wrote this. He also suggested, as if this wasn't radical enough, that there should be a ballot initiative in California. We do love our ballot initiatives, against what we call, or what he called, the eternal growth approach. Basically a ballot initiative that I suppose would say California would reject the continued growth paradigm, which has animated so much of our history. The linchpin, the bottom line, is that the state should promote every opportunity to improve conditions in less developed nations, even if the result is shipping jobs overseas. In other words, as if responding to his critics even before they raise their criticisms is, yes, I know you're going to call me racist or ethnocentric by saying we should discourage immigration. I'm sensitive to that, so what I want to suggest is that we ought to improve conditions in those less developed countries that produce high rates of immigration to the United States, and particularly to California, by investing and helping their economies and growing their economies, improving their rates of sustainability so that they won't come to California and use up all our water. Well, that's a mouthful, and it's a true story. And the book is appropriately called Water in the California Dream, Choices for the New Millennium. Well, where do we want to begin when we talk about ethical issues raised by this kind of work? Well, let me mention a couple things that I think are very salient for the subsequent discussions we're going to have this quarter on ethics and public policy and environmental ethics. First, who exactly decides who can live where? And what are the criteria for residing in California or any other state? One of the things that Carl is a bit vague on is exactly how we go about making decisions determining who can and who cannot come here. And of course, a question that sort of derives from that is, aren't we really favoring those who are already here and somehow ascribing to them a kind of a moral or ethical superiority from those who aren't yet living here? And is that right? Somehow that doesn't quite fit well with a lot of our natural intuition. And think about this one. Indeed, what Carl is suggesting is that people who would move to California, and in fact historically this has been true, came here for better opportunities. They were often unwanted in the parts of the United States or in other parts of the world that they migrated from in order to come to California. Is it fair? Is it equitable to discourage poorer groups who were seeking opportunities for a better life elsewhere from coming to some place where that opportunity might exist? You might say, sure it is, because we just don't have the resource base to support them. But to flip that around, people might say, and in fact have said in response to Carl, wait a minute. California didn't have those opportunities until people from other places came here and introduced innovations. It was immigration that translated into innovation. And in fact, you can start with the gold rush, or you could look at other periods of California history. Each time we had a wave of immigrants, those immigrants brought skills, imagination, energy, and a burning desire to create a better life, which benefited not just their generation, but future generations. So maybe we should say to Mr. Carl, not so fast. And then think about the flip side of that ethical argument. Again, this is one that we're going to really sink our teeth in as the quarter transpires. If you put limits on a public policy by saying that certain people cannot have certain opportunities, or certain resources cannot be accessed, or certain places or certain things will be closed off, do we in fact, in practice, encourage the well-off to be able to choose where to live and what resources to consume, and in fact, by implication, say to the less well-off that they should not have that same opportunity? This raises a question that social contract theorists, most recently the philosopher John Rawls, and we'll talk about him later in the course, suggests is one of the fallacies of this kind of approach to public policy. It essentially says this is a good policy if you already know what kind of opportunities you're going to be born into. But what if you don't know whether or not you're going to be well off or less well off? What would be the right thing to choose that would benefit everyone equally and fairly? And finally, this issue. This is a big quandary that we see in all public policy areas. We certainly see it in the area of environmental policy, and it's one we're going to come back to repeatedly in this course. Is protecting the environment and natural resources more important or as important as protecting other kinds of socially valued goods, such as democracy or human rights? In order to make the kind of decision Carl is talking about, you might be protecting the environment, but you may be doing so at the price of human rights and human dignity, and you might even be able to take away or justify taking away the political rights of a large group of citizens, namely the right to participate in the making of those decisions. So this is a real big issue, and it's a huge controversy that we're going to come back to repeatedly in the course. Well, two stories, lots of ethical issues embedded in here. Are there any things that we can say about these stories more generally that might help us understand some of the challenges facing the making and the implementation of environmental ethics and public policy, and public policy ethics more generally? Well, let me throw out a couple of things to think about by way of introducing some terms that may be new to you, but hopefully as you get into the reading and as we begin discussing these topics in the next several days, they'll become second nature to you. And let me start out with this general challenge. Is nature intrinsically, as opposed to extrinsically, valuable? And by intrinsically, as opposed to extrinsically valuable, we mean, does it have a value or a moral standing separate from that which we as human beings ascribe to it? When we say that something only has value because we ascribe a value to it, that's extrinsic. We're determining whether or not it's worth something, or whether it's not. Intrinsic, however, means it has a value whether we recognize it or not. And in fact, that value, including its right, shall we say, to survive and to thrive, owes nothing to us. It owes it to some other higher moral principle. So that's what we mean by the intrinsic value of nature as opposed to the extrinsic value of nature. This is true for all policy areas, but it's especially acute when we talk about natural resources, because oftentimes resources can't really speak for themselves. There was a book by a lawyer by the name of Christopher Stone some years ago, an article by the name of "Do Trees Have Standing?" And essentially what Stone was sort of debating or playing with his reader was the question as to whether or not trees can actually defend their rights? And of course the answer is not literally, but in fact if they do have a right to survive, or in Costanza's phrase earlier on, if they provide certain ecosystem services that have a value, is that value intrinsic and separate from what we ascribe or impart to it? Here's another challenge. Is nature instrumentally or extrinsically, as opposed to intrinsically, valuable? And if so, does it depend on a human viewpoint to decide? And what I mean by that is a little different from the first issue in the following way. Here we're not simply debating whether or not nature is instrumentally or extrinsically valuable, but whether or not the value of nature actually depends upon human beings to mediate. What if, in other words, there were no human beings around to enjoy or consume or use or even bear witness to the presence of certain resources? In other words, the resource had no instrumental or no humanly useful purpose whatsoever. Its value is simply by virtue of the fact that it exists. It was put there by someone or something for some reason that we may not understand. Does it really depend on a human viewpoint to decide? Or are we not even really determinative players in the game of deciding the value to be accorded to nature? Now, these are pretty deep questions. But they are questions, as we're going to see, that a lot of people are asking in the field of public policy as well as philosophy. And they're questions that have a lot of importance to understanding a lot of the robust debates in environmental policy. Particularly, just to give you a quick example, a debate that we're going to be looking at in a few weeks over what we call animal rights. Do animals really owe it to us to ascribe their value? Are they simply instrumental? That is to say, are they simply instruments of our pleasure that we can make into pets or put into zoos or aquaria? Or do they have a value that really does not depend on a human viewpoint to decide? And if so, on what viewpoint do we decide that they have a value? And finally, here's a general issue that I want you to begin thinking about, pondering and reflecting on, because it's an issue that, again, we're going to come back to at several stages in the course. This issue has to do with how we perceive, value, and act toward nature more generally. And here, it's not so much a purely ethical issue as it is very much an issue of social science. More specifically, as Robert Bellah will show, and as we will discuss in detail in coming weeks, it may be a function of whether or not we as human beings see ourselves as individuals who can somehow be separated from the world of nature and natural resources. In fact, perhaps we actually stand outside or removed from the environment. Maybe we are supposed to be masters of the physical universe, as opposed to seeing ourselves as part of a community that includes the interests of other people and the interests of the environment. Now, this is not just an academic or philosophical debate. Bellah, who is a sociologist, says that this is both an ethical problem in and of itself. How we view the world is very much a function of whether or not we view our individuality as the be-all and the end-all, as opposed to seeing ourselves as part of a community. But it's also a social science problem which relates to how different cultures value individualism versus the community. To telegraph for you what this argument means in practice, and why it's important both to environmental ethics and to the study of public policy more generally, what Bella suggests is that the United States is a very unique society because almost from its very foundation, our whole political value system, our whole system of political and social socialization, and thus our whole attitudes toward the role of government, whether it be the role of government toward protecting the environment, or the role of government toward protecting public health, or protecting social welfare, is basically geared around this notion of the individual and the rights of the individual as being the center of all public policy values, protecting the liberty and the freedom of that individual, protecting the autonomy and the sovereignty of that individual, protecting the right of that individual to consume and use resources, take precedent and priority, so says Bella. And this has implications for every policy area, especially for the environment. It means, among other things, that Americans have, if he is correct, a very difficult time with questions of community, with questions of a public good. And when it comes to things like the environment and other areas of public policy, so says Bella, we have a very difficult time placing a value on how something benefits future generations. We tend to be very present day oriented. And this is true whether we're talking about the environment, whether we're talking about health care, whether we're talking about the kinds of communities we want to live in, whether we're talking about jobs or economic development. We tend to think in terms of individual rights. We tend to think in terms of individual benefits. We tend not to think about community or implications to other species or other generations. Now, if Mr. Bella is correct, and he sure takes a long time getting to that point, as you'll see, it's a huge challenge for environmental ethics. It's a huge challenge for ethics and public policy, and it's a huge challenge for the study of public policy more generally. So let's spend the rest of today, the next 20 minutes or so, talking in some general terms about how we can know, or how those of us who study these issues, how we think we can know something is environmentally ethical. How do we actually make decisions about right, wrong, about questions of fundamental moral rights and wrongs when it comes to the environment, and again, more generally, when it comes to other areas of public policy. Well, let me start out by making some general observations about the importance of this whole debate over whether or not we can know what's environmentally ethical. There are a number of public policy scholars, and I cite 3 here, who have written over the past 30 years or so on exactly this question of the relationship between ethics, values, and beliefs, and the making and implementation of public policy, who argue that this is a very, very important subject that is intrinsic to the study of public policy. Charles Anderson, Hank Jenkins Smith, and Beryl Radin. All 3 are political scientists and public policy scholars, and they all agree that ethical values and beliefs underlie the making and the implementation of all public policy and public decisions. Even when policymakers say that they are making certain laws or rules or regulations without regard to lofty ethical goals, in fact, even if only implicitly, certain value assumptions, certain ethical assumptions underlie all public policy. And we're going to look at the specific criteria that go into making these claims momentarily. Here's something to think about. It may seem obvious, but it is something that we oftentimes overlook as being an important issue in the study of public policy and its relationship to ethics. If you choose one value system or ethical belief over another, the result is likely to be some very different environmental decisions, and decisions that might have some radically different environmental consequences. Think back to our two stories. If you choose to value the conservation and preservation of water, say, over the use of water, it may lead you to certain outcomes very similar to that which David Carl chose. And that may commit you to certain consequences that will have other ethical implications for both other resources or other policy areas, or to the treatment of people in some other dimension. We saw that. If in the case of the Costanza study, the value of ecological systems and their replacement values, one of the things that choosing the value of saying that these resources ought to be preserved or protected as opposed to exploited can have a number of different consequences, as we've already seen. Here it sort of depends on the interpretation you attach to it. Does this say that we can develop some resources and not others? Does it say that some resources are worth more than others, and that therefore we can exploit those that aren't worth very much while protecting those that are? So the point is that choosing one value over another can have very different decisions, lead to very different decisions, and have very different consequences. And then finally, this issue, which we're going to spend the rest of today talking about. How do we really know that anything having to do with ethics or morality even has an objective status? And by objective status here, what I mean is the same kind of status that we would accord an independent scientific finding. Can we actually get people to agree that issues related to right and wrong, good and bad, virtuousness and righteousness, evil and bad things, on the other hand, actually have some objective, or what social psychologists call a cognitive status? Is that even possible, or is that some kind of a pipe dream? Well, there's good reasons to believe it's not possible. And in fact, throughout much of the history of public policy and throughout much of the history of the philosophy of science, many people have simply chosen the alternative explanation that there will never be an objectively cognizable status that can be accorded ethical principles, or at least in the same kind of way that we might accord an objectivity to certain scientific principles. And there are at least 4 good reasons for this debate, and we're going to look at each one of these debates throughout the quarter. And in fact, a number of the questions that you're going to be asked to respond to in your short papers really take up this issue in various forms. Let me start out with one point that's pretty obvious and is enough to make even strong-willed people who want to believe that ethics have some objective status, it's enough to make us skeptics, if not cynics. There's disagreement over ethical values. Oh yeah, there sure is. People can agree in principle that we ought to be doing things that are right as opposed to wrong. that we ought to be trying to fulfill the good, whatever that is, as opposed to the bad. And that these ought to be values that are imposed within all public policies in all fields. But we can't help but conclude that, in fact, people disagree over these values. And people often disagree not only vigorously and forcefully, but they also often disagree in quite philosophically self-conscious ways. You know, how many of you have heard the argument, for example, that's often waged over the question of whether or not the government should provide a minimum level of health care in the United States? And you'll often hear arguments that'll kind of take this form. It is society's obligation to make sure that every human being has a minimal level of care. That is right, and that is just. And then you might hear an argument that says, it is the responsibility of each individual to make sure that he or she gets proper medical care and takes care of himself or herself so that his or her health is as good as it can be. It's not the responsibility of society, it's the responsibility of the individual. These are philosophical debates. They are ethical debates. And they are based, as we'll see, on different ethical principles, but they certainly conjure up lots of disagreement. And together with that is the fact that ethical values are difficult to, you'll notice in quotes, prove true. Now, the reason I put proof in quotes is because philosophers will argue, and in fact do argue, including the authors of a number of the readings that you're going to be looking at this quarter, argue that just because it's difficult to prove that one value is right and another value is wrong, doesn't mean that they don't have an objective or cognitive status. It might simply mean that the evidence that we offer to proving or indicating that one value is superior to another is very difficult to amass and very difficult to plow through. Difficult, not impossible. So proving may not be a simple matter of going out and doing a public opinion survey or a poll, figuring out what most people want. It's more cumbersome than that. It may be unpacking the meaning of language. It may be observing the consequences of choosing certain values upon one's personality and upon the world. It may be a matter of logically deconstructing an ethical argument into its finer implications and determining whether or not a particular recommendation that you would make to someone could actually be generalized to all people. Or perhaps that generalization would break down because it would be unworkable. You get the point. Difficult to prove true. Not necessarily impossible, just difficult. And thirdly, here's one that is also worth thinking about. It's certainly one that Mr. Bella spends a lot of time thinking about. And as students of public policy and urban planning and related fields, it's an issue that we all ought to be thinking about. When we adopt any ethical value, we implicitly ought to be professing that value. To adopt a value means that you are willing and able to actually live out the implications of that value. That you're not just saying, this is good for you, but it doesn't apply to me. It's saying, this is good for all of us, and I'm going to live my life according to my conviction. Now, a question that this raises is the deep personal and professional commitment each of us is required to make if we really believe our values. One of the challenges in all ethical systems, and in particular determining their objective status, is whether or not we in fact are even capable of giving that deep personal and professional commitment to the values we profess. In the environment, this is an area that we see every day of our lives. We profess sustainability, but we often behave in ways that are quite unsustainable, and in fact really raise the question as to whether or not we're being fully honest with ourselves and with others, or perhaps if we're sort of bending the rules because we live in a world where we have to compromise for a variety of reasons. Now, we all make those compromises, but the point is that some would argue that the very fact that any commitment requires a deep personal and professional commitment to this value, and the fact that it's difficult, if not impossible, to live that value, may mean that the value itself is not really valid. We'll come back to that argument later on in the course. And then finally, here's a public policy question for you. Oh, I definitely believe in animal rights. I fully embrace sustainability. I am totally committed to a lifestyle that vigorously advocates recycling and advocates having a small environmental footprint and doing everything that would be good for nature and other people. But you happen to work for a public or a private organization which in fact produces certain goods or services, or is engaged in some governmental activity that in fact works to promote exactly the opposite set of values you profess. How many of us have found ourselves in such a situation? If we're not all raising our hands, some of us are lying. We all face this dilemma. It is inevitable. Some philosophers would argue that the very fact that our values are difficult to live out within the organizations that we work in, the fact that they will either not support or even allow this, also makes the objective, realistic status of ethics very vague and sort of general, but not having much specific substance. Well, some things to think about. We'll come back to these issues much later. But I want to end today by laying out for you some of the major approaches to environmental ethics that we're going to spend the next several weeks talking about in detail. And many of these approaches are amplified by this week's readings, and some of them, in fact, are only hinted at, and we're going to be expanding a little bit over what this week's readings have to say by introducing some approaches that even go beyond what's in the texts. Now, the approaches that we're going to be talking about all share one thing in common. They are what philosophers call cognitivist approaches. Simply stated, these approaches all share the conviction that ethics in general, and environmental ethics in particular, absolutely have a valid, objective, big word, epistemological foundation. Now, epistemology is the study of knowledge. And when we say that something has an epistemological foundation, we mean that we can actually prove independently, validly, that these various traditions actually exist outside of our experience. They can be proven. There is evidence, whether it be empirical, whether it be logical, whether it be inductive, whether it be deductive, or whether it be some combination. Nevertheless, it has an epistemological foundation. They are clear and universal principles. By universal, we mean they're not just true for Americans. They're true for Americans and for French and for Japanese and Mexicans and for every society around the world. They apply to all people at all times. They exist free of human caprice. Just because you or I choose to ignore these principles doesn't mean that we can disregard the fact that we're bound by them in some moral sense. They can be disobeyed, but we all heard this when we were about 7 years old from our parents, but there are consequences. These are the 4 major traditions that we're going to spend the next 10 weeks talking about. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is simply introduce these, and then on Thursday we're going to talk in more detail about all 4 of these, and we're going to illustrate them with examples, and then we're going to pull out and distill their meanings for environmental policy and for public policy generally. Let's start with this first one, the natural law tradition. This is probably the oldest of all ethical traditions, and it is one that continues to resonate in the fields of public policy and certainly throughout the social sciences. Its advocates or exponents are varied. Plato, the great Greek philosopher, was certainly an advocate of natural law, as was his disciple Aristotle, as was Thomas Aquinas, a medieval philosopher who followed in the tradition of the ancient Greeks. And in the last century, the 20th century, social psychologists such as Abraham Maslow and Lawrence Kohlberg, an educational, developmental psychologist, all believed in something like a natural law tradition. Essentially, natural law can be defined as the belief that certain values have a universal cognitive status because by adopting those values, we find that they actually contribute, empirically contribute, to the fullest development of human beings. Now, this is very important. One of the things that characterizes natural laws, we'll see, is to place at the forefront of ethics human beings and human interests. How does this work? Well, basically what the natural law tradition says is that each and every human being is naturally ethical. Ethics is not learned. It is something that is ingrained virtually within our DNA. We, however, first learn to recognize ethics as we advance through stages of human development. We all start out, according to the ancient Greeks and according to these more modern philosophers and psychologists, Maslow and Kohlberg in particular, we all start out as somewhat, shall we say, narcissistic. We love ourselves. We want every one of our physical needs to be met. As infants, we don't even really think cognitively about our needs. We simply demand nourishment. We cry out for it, quite literally. But when we get to a certain stage in our development, both as individuals who are growing and as societies that are going through phases of economic growth and development, we come to recognize that needs for basic services, such as food and nutrition, are insufficient in defining our advancement. We get to a point where we need love, where we need affection, where we need caring and nurturance. And according to Maslow, as many of you know, we eventually get to a point in the normal course of human development, and that word normal has a lot of implications, as we'll see. In the normal course of development, we get to a point where we actually need to become self-actualized, autonomous, individuated entities that are not only able to be nourished on our own and receive love, but to give it, to have empathy, and to actually want to be autonomously capable of making changes in our environmental surroundings. Kohlberg, who, as I said, was an educational psychologist, took this even further and argued that this was one of the principles that in his empirical studies made moral development in virtually every society to follow identical patterns. As people mature, if their basic needs are met, in the normal course of development, they are able to make decisions over moral choices and over questions of freedom and autonomy in ways that are comparable across cultures. Now, I might add, this is research, as we're going to see, that is by no means universally accepted by everyone. The natural law tradition is just that. It's a tradition. It's accepted by some. It's not suggested by all. It's not accepted by all. But the notion that whatever serves to the fullest development of the entire array of human needs is a good is a very fundamental ingredient of ethical debates and public policy debates, particularly in Western societies. When we debate issues of nutrition, health care, educational policy, social welfare policy, and yes, the environment, we often adopt something like a natural law tradition. This notion that if you look at human beings empirically, you actually see the development of moral norms that goes through stages. And the commonality of these moral norms mean that we all share an underlying set of cognitively defensible ethical norms. We'll come back to the implications of that later. Let me jump to this second approach. Some argue that utilitarianism, the notion of whatever accrues to the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, being defined as the good, is actually a kind of derivative from the natural law tradition, except applied in a more self-serving or self-aggrandizing way. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, British philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, were strong architects of the utilitarian tradition in ethics and public policy. They were both also fervent advocates of what we would now call the public choice approach, which basically says that in determining what is good public policy, we want to basically poll not only what most people would define as good, that's easy, but what most people would intensely define as being the most pleasurable. It's not just the numbers, it's the intensity of what we value as good that helps define for us what is a benefit. Now, as we're going to see later on, one of the criticisms of utilitarianism as a basis for environmental ethics is that not only does it tend to exalt human interests over the interests of other species, but in fact it tends to exalt the notion of development and in fact seeking to exploit the world and everything in it in order to accrue the greatest benefit, i.e. the greatest pleasure, for the greatest number of people. And in fact, many argue that utilitarianism is an environmental ethic that, while very common, also is very problematical. Thirdly, is a view that began really in the 18th century with Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, also called the modern analytical view, and it's one that was later adopted, as we'll see, by John Rawls, who's a philosopher who, as I mentioned earlier, believed in a social contract view of society. The Kantian or modern analytical view says, wait a minute, forget about human pleasure, forget about what accrues to the greatest good of the greatest number, and by all means, forget about natural law. There are lots of things that we ought to do simply because they are right. But what makes them right isn't the fact that they give us pleasure. They may, in fact, give us a certain amount of anxiety. There are certain things that are good not because they represent something that came about through the fullest development of our human ego or benefit, but because they have to do with putting ourselves in the position of those who are less well off than you. Some would call this the golden rule. Kant, in fact, identified the view that he was espousing in this notion of the modern analytical view as a categorical imperative. And in fact, he said that it was a view that he understood to be embedded in most of the world's great religious faiths. It's a view that says we ought to do certain things not because they benefit us personally, but because if we put ourselves in the same category as others who are less well off, we will find that it is an imperative that we must act upon. For example, lying. Why is it wrong to lie? The natural law tradition doesn't really have much to say about lying. Why should we uphold agreements that we freely made? Well, utilitarians don't have much to say about that. In fact, they might say, if they were bothered by it at all, that we should basically do whatever we can get away with, if it gives us pleasure, and if it doesn't hurt anybody. Kant would say there are certain principles that are right because if we fail to uphold them, and we generalize that conduct to others, human relations, amicable human relations, would be impossible and unpredictable. This is what makes it categorical. We should treat every other being the way we would have them treat us. This means sometimes sacrificing. It means always being honest. It means carrying out promises that we've made freely and without duress. Because if we fail to keep our promises, what's to stop anyone else from carrying out theirs? Again, this is a very compelling ethical system. How it applies to the environment, where it might break down in the environment, is one that we're going to examine on Thursday. And finally, we need to say something about this approach to public policy ethics and environmental ethics, certainly. Divine revelation or divine law. There is a long-standing belief, and as we're going to see on Thursday, it's not a belief that's unique to the United States or to Europe or to what we would call the Western world. It is, in fact, something that is ubiquitous in virtually all societies, that says that there may be a cognitive universal status that can be accorded to ethical principles based on some sort of divine or universal power, divine law perhaps. In environmental ethics, Lynn White, we'll talk about him later on, and Holmes Ralston both advocate the position that when we obey what they call the eternal laws of a deity, of God, One of those eternal laws is treating the environment with respect, and most importantly, with an attitude of caring and stewardship. And they argue that this is not simply a universal law because God says so, but that in fact you can actually trace this tradition, this strong sense of obedience to this divinely inspired notion in virtually every culture. It's a very compelling argument. We're going to examine that argument, and we're going to look at its implications. So, I think we've probably done a pretty fair job of hopefully laying out some of the major issues in environmental ethics that we're going to be talking about this quarter. And when I see you on Thursday, we'll start by actually talking about some examples of these major approaches and their implications. And best of all, you'll have an opportunity to express your views, and we'll have a chance to debate and have a dialogue about the examples and the principles themselves. So I'll see you then. Have a good week.